James Luckhurst of Project Edward hears from Dr. Elizabeth Box of the RAC Foundation about how education fits into the bigger picture of keeping young drivers safe.
Well, I've been very fortunate to come to Drug 24 to talk about some of the education work that I've been doing as part of my own research work, really understanding how do we educate pre-drivers to help them make better decisions when they're on the roads.
And how does education fit into, because there's lots of ways we can encourage or cajole young drivers to make better decisions. How does education fit into that? How important is it within the jigsaw?
Yes, so obviously a big part of the sessions at the conference have been about education. And the work that I've been doing is traditionally we focused on kind of consequences, don't do this because this is the bad outcomes. And of course, we need to understand what the consequences of behaviour are. But what we find from the research is actually, especially with young people, we need to talk about the skills and capabilities that they need. So is it about speaking up? Is it about working out in advance? What are those things I'm going to do to kind of help save face in the time when I'm finding it really hard? So we know particularly with that audience, they're going to face challenges. So the education is all about how can we support them best to do that, rather than scaring them about what might happen, but actually helping them develop those skills and capabilities.
So is shock and horror very much a thing of the past?
Well, it's really interesting when you look at the research evidence. So fear and threat appeals, they do have a role to play, but only in very specific circumstances. So if you had to have a one-time behaviour that you were to perform, then maybe it's got some validity. Also, it can be particularly effective with female audiences, but obviously, particularly on the young driver's perspective, we're looking at young males, and therefore they're much more likely to experience what we call third-person effects. So they go, that's awful, that doesn't happen to me though, that happens to other people, and dismiss and dissociate from the message. So the general advice in the public health field is that we need to deliver trauma-informed education, so that's actually going to help them develop those capabilities to be safer in the future.
Let me just find out, give us your take on Drug 24 and the kind of energy and the relevance of the messages and the conversations that have been had on the stage during the past couple of days.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting for me to attend Drug 24 because coming from a kind of research and policy background, obviously there's been a lot of police services here talking about operations and kind of how that works in practice. But for me, it was certainly very interesting to kind of hear some of the ins and outs, particularly around the forensic testing and how the challenges are faced between drug and drink driving and what implications that has for bringing to court and actually progressing those cases. So I could sense in the room that it was really helpful for people to be there to talk to other forces, to understand what challenges they're facing, to see kind of how they compare, what best practice is. And, that's always the value, I think, of conferences such as this.
Last question, Liz. There seems to be some energy, some growing energy and publicity relating to graduated driver licensing. Tell us what you know so far, who's become interested, and is there a chance that it can be taken seriously by a government in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, when we look at the research around what's most likely to be effective for young and novice drivers in sort of improving their safety, reducing killed and seriously injured collisions, graduated driver licensing internationally has been found to reduce deaths and serious injuries by 20 to 40% in that group. So it can have a massive difference. And we've known this in the research for a long time. We've done work on it at the RAC Foundation over the last 10 years. But I think the most recent interest has very much been driven by bereaved family members. And there's a group that's coming together now, I think consists of around 80 different families who've been bereaved, who've lost young people who they believe would have been saved if the graduated driver licensing process was in place. The media have been extremely supportive, actually, of kind of presenting their cases and talking about the evidence. And very recently, we've had Kim Leadbeater, who's kind of gone in and with her 10-minute bill to really kind of test and see what the views are in Parliament on this. So it's really positive because, the role of government is to legislate, they can educate and they can fund. And obviously, they do a huge amount of work around the Think campaign. But as I've been talking about at the conference, education is important, but we can't expect to achieve as much as some other changes. It's important to support those changes, but what we really need is government to lead with legislation here because we know that it can save lives.